add in a P. P, and then we have the elasticity.
Okay, yeah, that sounds good. So if we do
we have the inverse of the elasticity.
over P, we get 1 plus that there. And then you're saying P prime is going to give us
Well, that's the inverse of the elasticity.
this expression here. Yeah, this is exactly the inverse of the elasticity, right? Because P prime, if we flip that over by the implicit function theorem, we can cross this out and we can get a Q prime down here. And then we have Q prime times P over Q on the bottom, and that's exactly the negative elasticity of demand, right? So that's what gives us this formula. Yeah, okay. So one thing this immediately tells us is that if the marginal revenue will always be negative whenever the elasticity of demand is less than 1. So if the elasticity of demand is less than 1, revenues will be declining as we increase quantity. And therefore, a monopolist with, positive marginal costs will never produce a point where the elasticity of demand is less than 1. And they'll always have an incentive to reduce the quantity at that point because they can save on their costs and they can they can increase the price that they charge. Yeah.
But regularly you will think that one becomes a monopolist when the elasticity is less than 1, right? And then you start pricing as a monopolist.
Well,
because you want to think that you become a monopolist when the elasticity is when the demand is inelastic, and then you will start pricing as a.
Well, I think as this analysis is going to indicate, the degree to which you have an optimal incentive to increase your price is related to your elasticity. But you could well be a monopolist with a very high elasticity of demand, right? So I'm not sure that it's true. If your elasticity is extremely, extremely, extremely high, then we can basically ignore any incentive that you have to distort your price. But on the other hand, an elasticity of 4 or 5 will still lead to a substantial markup, as we'll see in a moment. So you can have significant market power even when a firm has an elasticity well above 1. So this is sort of the most extreme case, but I would guess that there probably aren't that many cases when a monopoly initially faces an elasticity of demand, which is less than 1. But there probably are some.
So do you mind giving some intuition of why the monopolist is standing in the elastic part of the demand?
Yeah, sure. So if the monopolist is producing in a part of the demand where it's inelastic, then he can actually raise his total income by just reducing the quantity, right? So the marginal revenue is negative, right? And so that's never going to be optimal as long as it costs him anything to produce the product, right? So, I mean, one example of this, by the way, is there's been in recent years a lot of drug wars in Central America, and the United States has tried to reduce the supply of goods coming in. But actually, in the process, they've increased the amount of violence that goes on to compete for the profits in the industry. Why? Because the demand for most drugs is pretty inelastic. And so by reducing the quantity, you actually raise the price, increase the total amount of profits that the gangs are making, and therefore increase violence to try to obtain those profits. So you're essentially doing exactly what someone who had a monopoly over drug production would do. You're reducing the quantity when the demand is inelastic. So the elasticity of demand is sort of the key way that economists summarize the incentive that firms have to raise their price under monopoly. So it's sort of an overall summary of how big a firm is in the market and how small are the opportunities of consumers to substitute to alternative goods. If we just rearrange, setting that formula equal to marginal cost, we obtain the classic learner elasticity pricing rule, which states that the difference between price and cost, the markup, divided by price, that's often called the relative markup, is equal to the inverse elasticity of demand. So the more elastic is demand, the smaller is the markup. So to return to the question, if the even if the elasticity were 4, you would still have a relative markup of 25%. So 25% of the price of the good would represent the monopoly's markup. So this is commonly used as a measure of market power, a measure of how much monopoly there is in some sense. But one thing to note is that can be a bit problematic in certain cases. So if you think about the credit card industry, I don't know how many of you guys have credit cards, probably most of you, but you actually basically get paid to use your credit card, right? They give you points rather than you having to pay anything. And so they're basically charging you a negative price. Now does that mean that you have a negative elasticity of demand? Well, probably not, right? And the reason is that the marginal cost they face is not actually positive because they're able to earn money off merchants every time you use your card. So they're actually being subsidized. And so once something's being subsidized, this learner rule really doesn't make very much sense at all. So often in cases like that, it makes more sense to use the absolute markup that the firm charges, which is just that P prime times Q formula that we talked about earlier. Yeah, go ahead.
I think from the other side, I mean, they're charging the merchants the privilege to be able to let customers pay with the card.
Yeah.
They do have a cost of giving that because they have to pay us to use the card.
Yes.
And then they charge the merchant a markup over the cost they give us, right?
Yeah.
We get 1% rewards and the merchant has to pay 2% or
Yeah.
whatever it is.
Well, so you could think about the market power in that aggregated way, or you could think about it in each market independently. So they certainly probably have some market power over the merchants, but I think it would be a bit strange to think that you don't have market power over consumers because there are only 4 major credit card companies basically, and most people are pretty stuck with them. So I think that if they weren't being subsidized by the merchants, you would be seeing significant markups, and we shouldn't sort of ignore that market power they have over consumers just because they're getting this subsidy, right? So if you choose to view the market power in this disaggregated way, it's important not to just think about the inverse elasticity because that doesn't really make much sense. And instead think about the absolute markup they charge over the profits that they're earning per transaction you do from the merchants. In fact, we're going to study exactly the model that you were suggesting in one of the future lectures. So we'll talk more about that issue. Yeah, go ahead.
But net, is it fair to say that the consumer is getting subsidized given all the financing costs are being charged to consumers who are not paying their credit card balances every month? I mean,
yeah. So I mean, it's a bit complicated. I think the evidence suggests that on net they are being subsidized significantly, but that there are some consumers who get in a lot of trouble. But I would guess, though I'm not sure, that most of you are in the camp that you're being heavily subsidized. I certainly am. If you are sort of smart and pay off your credit card bills, you end up getting subsidized in equilibrium, and it's sort of like poor, uninformed people who end up helping to further subsidize you along with the merchants. So the monopoly basically has 2 effects from a normative perspective. First of all, it transfers wealth from consumers to the monopolists, right? Because it raises prices, and that means consumers pay more than monopolists receive. But this doesn't have, at least at the first pass, any net social loss associated with it, right? It's just a transfer. But there's a second effect of monopoly, which is that it reduces the quantity of the goods consumed. Because in order to raise the price, the monopolist has to reduce the number of sales that occur. And basically what that means is that there's some people who would be willing to pay a price below the monopoly price, but above the monopoly's costs, who are denied access to the market. And this is what's called the deadweight loss from monopoly. And the key reason, again, is that the monopolist, in order to charge more for his inframarginal units, has to charge more also for the marginal units. And this is not something the monopolist is, delighted about, that he's causing all this deadweight loss. In fact, this is exactly what he'd like to avoid. So do in rich countries, because they don't gain anything from losing all the sales that they could make at a price that people in that less well-off market can afford. If they are forced to, if they can't stop someone from re-importing things from the poor countries, okay, they're going to charge, $1 million for ACT, the, most effective AIDS treatment, and exclude all these people in poor countries. But if they can if there's some way for them to discriminate and be able to charge those marginal consumers a lower price than the marginal consumers, they're going to be really happy about that. And in fact, you can interpret many of the things that a monopolist does from the way he prices, or as we'll talk about in the other lecture, how he designs his products, as an attempt to charge lower prices effectively to marginal and inframarginal consumers. So for example, as we'll talk about later, he's going to try to design his products to bring a lot of benefits to marginal consumers and not so many benefits to inframarginal consumers. So, basically the consequences of having this price above marginal cost are that anyone who buys from the monopolist generates an externality. What's that externality? Well, he creates some profits for the monopolist, right? The difference between price and marginal cost is the marginal profit the monopolist earns as a result of someone purchasing the product, right? And that means that, and the only way to internalize that externality, of course, is to put a subsidy which is equal to the markup, right? Which would bring you back to the competitive level. So this creates sort of a natural question, which is, if market power is really just an externality, why don't we just internalize it in the same way we do any other externality? Why don't we just give a subsidy to firms that are monopolists? Or why don't we mandate higher quantities, like you would in something like cap and trade, right? In practice, we really don't use these solutions very often. It's very uncommon that a response to market power is to subsidize the good. Jorge Garcia, why do you think we might not use Pigouvian remedies to solve market power problems?
I mean, which quantity you will mandate? I really don't know which will be the quantity you will mandate.
So that's one good point, right? So the monopolist may know a lot more about his cost function than you do, and you may have an incentive to distort the quantity that is optimal downward in order to try to raise his markup if you mandate quantity. And if you try to subsidize the monopolist, right, to bring down his markup to cost, he's going to want that subsidy to be as big as possible, and so he's going to claim his markup is huge, right? So it may be very difficult to design a system that gives the monopolist an incentive to truthfully reveal the quantity. So those are two major issues. Another major problem is that, so we were treating the transfers to the monopolist as if they were just, socially neutral. We didn't care whether the monopolist got the money or not, right? Because it was just a transfer. But the problem with that perspective is that usually monopolies don't just come out of thin air. They come out of some action that people take. So you could invent a new product that's really beneficial to society, and that could help create a monopoly, right? Or you could lobby the government, waste a bunch of money lobbying the government to exclude people from competing with you, right? And that's a total waste to society, that expenditure. And so the money that the monopolist makes is not just really a transfer, it's really an input to another stage of thinking where the monopolist whether someone's determining whether to try to obtain a monopoly or not. And so the subsidies that you give or do not give have an important impact on whether people end up doing things like lobbying the government, innovating, and the subsidies, you're going to want to target the subsidies to areas